Have you ever had that feeling, where you get a glimpse behind the scenes of something huge? Like
Yeah.
you're peeking behind the curtain and seeing how this massive machine actually works? Well, today we're going to try to give you exactly that feeling as we do a deep dive into the inner workings of one of the most influential companies on the planet,
We are.
Facebook. And we'll be looking at it through the lens of Sarah Wynn-Williams' book, Careless People, which just so happened to hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list this past March.
A #1 bestseller, that's right.
So we're not just skimming the surface here.
No.
This deep dive is going to be a real all-access pass into the company's culture, its evolution, and really the impact it's had on all of us.
Absolutely. And what makes this deep dive so special for our listeners is that we're going beyond those typical headlines and those sort of sanitized PR statements that we often get from these companies. And we're really going to dig into the nitty-gritty details of what it was actually like to work at Facebook during a period of just absolutely explosive growth, right through the eyes of someone who was there in the trenches, Sarah Wynn-Williams.
Right, she was right there in the thick of it.
Exactly.
And let's be honest, I mean, the amount of information out there about Facebook, about social media in general, it can be so overwhelming.
Absolutely.
It's hard to know where to even begin.
Right. It's a fire hose of information, isn't it?
It is. So that's really our mission today, right? To cut through all that noise and guide you through Wynn-Williams' own personal journey through the heart of this company.
It is.
Because her story, which again propelled this book to the top of the bestseller list, it's not just about a company's growth. It's really about the collision of, idealistic intentions, good intentions, with the realities of power and, well, human nature.
Right, because you have to remember, she didn't go into Facebook as some kind of, I don't know, jaded cynic or someone who already had this, preconceived notion of what the company was all about.
Right.
She joined around 2009. She actually had this pretty amazing background. She worked in environmental bureaucracy. Then she went to the New Zealand embassy in DC, all sorts of different things. But she really believed in Facebook's potential to change the world.
She really bought into that whole, making the world a more open and connected place idea.
She did. She really did. And I think that's actually a really important point for us to understand because it kind of sets the stage for, the journey that she takes us on throughout the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because she's not just coming in as an outsider looking in, she's starting out as a true believer, which makes her eventual disillusionment all the more, I don't know, impactful, I guess.
Yeah, it definitely adds a whole other layer to it.
It does. And you can see this idealism really clearly in her early attempts to connect with Facebook.
Right. She wasn't just passively observing this whole thing unfold.
No, not at all. She was actually trying to get involved, even before they really had a dedicated policy team or anything like that.
Yeah, she recognized that, political discourse was moving online, moving to these platforms.
Oh, absolutely.
And she was really convinced that Facebook would have a huge role to play in shaping the rules of that game.
Exactly. She saw this massive shift happening,
Yeah.
and she wanted to be part of it.
And so what did she do? She actually reached out, started pitching her ideas about political engagement on the platform.
She did, and it wasn't easy.
Uh-huh.
Facebook back then was just laser focused on product development, on growth, on getting more users.
Right.
They weren't really thinking about the bigger picture in the same way that she was.
Right. They were kind of in that, move fast and break things phase.
Yeah, exactly. So finding the right people to even talk to within the company, people who would actually listen to her perspective, that was a huge challenge for her.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so for a while there, she was kind of in this in-between space, wasn't she?
She was, yeah.
Feeling like her ideas were either, brilliant
Right.
or totally misguided.
Or completely off the mark. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, right?
Yeah.
When you have this conviction about something, but you're not sure if you're just, out of touch with reality.
Especially when you're trying to convince a company that's moving at warp speed.
Exactly.
They're not exactly known for slowing down and listening to outside perspectives.
No, not at all. But then, things started to shift a little bit.
Okay, so what happened? What changed?
Well, in 2010, they hired Marn Levine.
Okay.
And this was a really big deal because it signaled that Facebook was finally starting to take the political realm seriously.
Right. They were realizing they couldn't just ignore this whole aspect of their platform anymore.
Exactly. And Wynn-Williams, she saw this as her opportunity, Finally, someone who might actually understand what she was trying to say.
So she really made an effort to connect with Levine to try to convince her of Facebook's central role in all of this.
She did, and she actually talks about this internal struggle she had, feeling like, am I being brilliant or am I just being completely naive?
Well, I can relate to that.
I think we all can, right? It's that feeling of, do I really have something valuable to offer or am I just kidding myself?
Right, and I think it's especially tough when you're trying to be an early advocate for something that hasn't really become mainstream yet.
Absolutely. It's like you're trying to convince people that, the earth is round when everyone else thinks it's flat.
That's a good analogy.
So she's having these conversations with Levine, trying to really articulate her vision. And, eventually she actually manages to get some traction.
Okay, so she starts to make some headway.
She does. And one of the things that she's really proud of, and I think this is something that our listeners should really pay attention to, is that she was involved in setting up the very first community guidelines for Facebook.
Oh, wow. So she was there at the very beginning of that whole process.
She was. And, those early transparency reports that Facebook started putting out, she had a hand in those as well.
That's pretty significant. I mean, those are kind of foundational documents, aren't they?
Absolutely. They were trying to, establish some ground rules, some basic principles for how this whole online world would operate.
Right, like trying to bring some order to the Wild West of the internet.
Exactly. And, Wynn-Williams, she really believed in the importance of this work.
Yeah.
But even in those early days, there were already some hints of, I don't know, some of the problems that would emerge later on.
Oh, okay. So what kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, she describes this one policy team gathering. And, you'd think that they would be sitting down, having these serious discussions about the future of online communication.
Right, the impact on society, all
Yeah,
that.
exactly. But instead, they were doing icebreaker games, personality quizzes.
Really?
Yeah. And, on the surface, it might seem like a small thing, but I think it kind of speaks to this potential disconnect between, the seriousness of what they were supposed to be doing and the kind of culture that was developing within the company.
Right. Like maybe they weren't quite grasping the full weight of their responsibility yet.
Yeah, maybe. And then there's the whole organ donation project.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that in the book.
Yeah, so this was supposed to be, a demonstration of Facebook using its platform for good.
Yeah.
They were partnering with governments to try to promote organ donation.
Okay.
And Wynn-Williams, she was really excited about this project.
Yeah.
Sheryl Sandberg was behind it. And the idea was to actually feature organ donation registration prominently on people's profiles.
So that, when people were updating their relationship status or whatever, they could also sign up to be an organ donor.
Exactly. But it quickly became this kind of microcosm of all the internal conflicts that were brewing within Facebook.
Okay, so what went wrong?
Well, you had the engineering teams who, as Wynn-Williams describes it, they held a lot of sway within the company.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ones building the product.
Exactly. And they started raising concerns about the pop-up being too intrusive for users.
Oh, okay, so they were worried about the user experience.
Exactly. And, this created this tension between the policy team who wanted to promote social good.
Right.
And the engineers who were focused on, keeping users happy and engaged.
So it was kind of a clash of priorities.
It really was. And then Mark Zuckerberg himself, he wasn't really that enthusiastic about the project either.
Oh, really? I mean, you'd think he would be on board with something like this.
You would, wouldn't you? But he apparently sided with the engineers. And, when the CEO sides with someone, that's usually the end of the discussion.
Yeah, no arguing with the boss, especially when it's Mark Zuckerberg.
Right. And so Wynn-Williams felt like the project was basically dead in the water.
Stalled.
Totally stalled. And then she gets this email, this 4-word email from Mark.
4 words.
4 words. I am overruling you.
Wow, straight to the point.
No messing around. And this, I think, really illustrates the power dynamics within the company, right?
Absolutely. It shows where the ultimate authority lies. And, for Wynn-Williams, it was a pretty big setback.
It was, not just for the project itself, but also for her hopes of building a good working relationship with Mark and Sheryl.
Right, because she was kind of caught in the middle there.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that even when you have a good idea, even when you have the best intentions, navigating those internal power structures can be really tricky.
Especially in a place like Facebook.
Especially in a place like Facebook, yeah.
So as we move through the book, we see Wynn-Williams starting to really grapple with the immense power and wealth that's swirling around her at Facebook.
Yeah, that's a big theme.
And one of the most striking examples of this is her trip to Cartagena with Javier Olivan.
Right, the Summit of the Americas.
Exactly. So he's going to this gathering of presidents and prime ministers.
Not exactly your typical Facebook event, right?
No, not at all. And Wynn-Williams, with her background in diplomacy, she's trying to make sure that everything goes smoothly.
She's thinking protocol, she's thinking etiquette, she's thinking about all the formalities.
Right, but Facebook has a very different approach, don't they?
They do. They're much more informal, much more focused on, growth in relationships.
Right, and they're about to go public, so there's this huge IPO looming over everything.
Exactly. So their main objective in Cartagena isn't necessarily to have these deep, meaningful conversations with world leaders.
It's more about making sure that Javier is happy.
Yeah, making sure he's having a good time, making sure he feels valued, especially with the IPO coming up.
Right, because he's a key player.
Absolutely. And so you have this clash of cultures, right?
Yeah.
You have Wynn-Williams with her diplomatic sensibilities, and then you have Facebook with their Silicon Valley kind of, move fast and break things mentality.
Right, and it's interesting because at this point, Facebook isn't quite the global powerhouse that it will become. Yeah.
That's right. They're still trying to find their place on the world stage.
Yeah, and one of the things that really highlights this is that they don't even have assigned seating at the state dinner.
Right. They're kind of relegated to the sidelines.
Yeah, they're with the assistants and the security guards.
And Wynn-Williams is trying to drum up interest in Facebook among these officials.
Yeah, who in many cases have never even heard of it.
Exactly. So it's a completely different world from, a few years later when world leaders are practically begging to meet with Mark Zuckerberg.
Right, that's a great point. I mean, this really shows you how quickly things can change.
It really does. And I think it also says something about Facebook's own internal confidence, even at this stage where they're not getting that formal recognition.
They know they're on the rise.
They know they're on the rise. Exactly.
And another thing that Wynn-Williams talks about a lot in this section of the book is the just sheer wealth that's on display at Facebook, especially after the IPO.
Yeah, she describes the big engagement rings, the diamond bracelets, the Louis Vuitton handbags.
Right, it's like this whole other level of affluence.
It is. And then you have these anecdotes about employees like Sam Lessin, who's openly saying that he's price insensitive.
Oh, right. He doesn't even think about money anymore.
Exactly. And then there's Debbie, who she calls the economic volunteer.
Because she's already rich from the Google IPO.
Exactly. So her Facebook salary is basically pocket change.
Yeah, and so you have this really interesting dynamic within the company where, for some people, money is almost a non-issue.
Right. It's just not a factor in their decision-making at all.
But for others, like Wynn-Williams, they're still operating within a much more, normal financial framework.
Exactly. And that inevitably shapes how people view the world and how they make decisions.
Absolutely. And then there's this other kind of currency at Facebook, isn't there?
What's that?
Stamina.
Oh, yeah, stamina.
That relentless drive, that constant push to work harder, longer, to be more productive.
And the willingness to sacrifice your personal life for the company?
Yeah, and this becomes something that Wynn-Williams shares with her colleagues, people like Marn, Elliot, Cheryl, even though their financial circumstances are totally different.
Right, it's like this common thread that binds them together.
And it makes you wonder about the cost of all that,
It does, because you can't just keep pushing yourself like that indefinitely without something giving.
Exactly. And you can see this very clearly in the episode with the New Zealand Prime Minister.
Oh, that's a great example.
So the Prime Minister's office, they're anticipating these substantial discussions about technology, innovation, all that.
Right, high-level stuff.
But Cheryl, she's mostly focused on the Prime Minister's Facebook page.
And whether he's using it effectively.
Yeah, and she even asks Wynn-Williams to locate Choppy, this person in Queenstown, for what she calls the real tour.
Right, which is just completely baffling to Wynn-Williams, who's thinking, shouldn't we be talking about something more important?
Yeah, it's like this total disconnect between traditional diplomacy and Facebook's way of doing things.
Yeah. And then, to top it all off, Mark refuses to even meet with the Prime Minister.
Yeah, he just flat out says, no, I definitely didn't want to do that.
As a global power in its own right.
Yeah, like they don't have to play by the same rules as everyone else.
Exactly. And that attitude, as we'll see, it's going to have some pretty big consequences down the line.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those consequences, because the book takes us on this whirlwind tour of global encounters.
It does.
And each one of them reveals something new about Facebook's evolving role in the world.
Absolutely. And, one of the most interesting stops on this tour is Germany.
Okay, why Germany?
Well, Germany has this very particular history with surveillance, right?
Right, the Stasi, the Gestapo.
Exactly. So they're naturally very suspicious of any company that's collecting vast amounts of data on its users.
But they're seeing Facebook as a potential tool of mass surveillance,
Yeah, and they're not exactly thrilled about it.
which is a very different reaction from what Facebook is used to getting in other parts of the world.
It is, and it's a really important perspective for us to consider because it highlights the fact that Facebook's values, the whole openness and connectivity thing,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily translate well across different cultures.
Yeah, different countries have different histories, different concerns.
Exactly. And then there's the trip to Myanmar.
Oh, man, that whole section of the book is just wild.
It's intense, isn't it?
It is. So Wynn-Williams is sent to Myanmar to try to engage with the government, which is still under Chinta rule at this point.
Right, and the country's basically just emerging from decades of isolation.
And she describes this, like, surreal experience of driving down this 20-lane highway that's completely deserted.
Yeah, and these massive government buildings that are basically empty.
It's like a ghost town.
It is, and she's having all this trouble just trying to connect with Aung San Suu Kyi.
Right, who's still under house arrest at this point.
Exactly, and it just shows you the challenges of trying to impose, a Western-centric technology model on a country that's just so different.
Yeah, like Facebook is coming in with this whole idea of democratizing information.
Right.
But the reality on the ground is just so much more complicated.
It is, and then you contrast that with the trip to Japan.
Okay, so how is Japan compared to Myanmar?
Well, Japan is a much more developed country, right?
Yeah.
And they're actually quite receptive to Facebook.
Oh.
They see the potential benefits of the platform, especially for things like disaster response.
Right, they've had their fair share of natural disasters.
They have, and so they're having these very practical conversations about how Facebook can be used to help people in times of crisis.
And Cheryl even lobbies for changes in Japanese law regarding how politicians can use Facebook for elections.
Which is a really interesting detail because it shows how Facebook is starting to see itself as, a political force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, they're not just a social network anymore.
No, they're shaping the rules of the game.
And of course, no meeting with a world leader would be complete without a gift of lean in.
It's like the obligatory souvenir.
It is, but then, you have the meeting with the Prime Minister of India.
Right, and that conversation takes a very different turn.
It does, because they start talking about the use of Facebook in elections, and that's when things get a little bit more, I don't know, ethically complicated.
Yeah, because India is a massive democracy with a huge and growing population of internet users.
Right.
So the potential for manipulation, for spreading misinformation, is just enormous.
Yeah, and this is something that will come back to haunt Facebook over and over again.
Absolutely. This is the beginning on a very long and very messy story.
It is, and speaking of messy, let's talk about Sheryl Sandberg, because her influence is something that really runs throughout the entire book.
Yeah, she's a major character.
She is, and one of the first things that we see is this incident with Asiana Airlines.
Oh, right, the plane crash that she wasn't even on?
Exactly. So she posts on Facebook about narrowly avoiding this crash. She even tags her colleagues.
And of course, everyone's freaking out, thinking she was almost killed.
But she wasn't even supposed to be on that flight.
No, she was booked on a different one.
And Wynn-Williams even gets a message from a friend asking if Cheryl's okay.
Right, because it's just so strange.
Yeah, it's like, why would you even post about that?
And I think it raises some interesting questions about, the pressure to project a certain image online, even when it doesn't quite match reality.
Yeah, like you have to constantly be performing this perfect version of yourself.
Exactly. And then there were these other incidents that Wynn-Williams witnesses, like Debbie getting publicly reprimanded for being late,
Oh, wow.
and the whole thing with the missing badge at Davos.
Right, where Cheryl just flips out.
It's like these little glimpses into this very intense, high-pressure environment.
Where even the smallest mistakes can have huge consequences.
Absolutely, and it creates this culture where everyone's walking on eggshells.
Yeah, trying not to make a wrong move.
Exactly, and then there's a whole issue of returning to work after childbirth.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because Wynn-Williams feels this immense pressure to come back to work before her maternity leave is even over.
Even though she's just had a baby.
Yeah, she's bringing her newborn daughter to work events. She's even getting detained at the Canadian border because she's traveling for work with the baby.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. And, Cheryl's advice to her is to hire a Filipina nanny.
Which is a pretty loaded statement, isn't it?
It is, because it reveals a certain level of, I don't know, cultural insensitivity, maybe?
Yeah, like a lack of awareness about the complexities of childcare and domestic work.
And then there's Women's Day at Facebook, which is supposed to be this empowering event.
Right, celebrating women in the workplace.
But Wynn-Williams describes it as this weird mix of like an evangelical church, a multi-level marketing conference, a Tony Robbins seminar, a yoga retreat, and an Oprah Winfrey show all rolled into one.
Wow, that's quite a combination.
It is, and she points out that the stories that are being shared about motherhood, they often leave out the crucial role played by nannies and other support systems.
Right, so it's this very curated version of reality.
Exactly, and it makes you wonder about the authenticity of the whole thing, you know?
Yeah, like, is this really about empowering women, or is it just about, looking good?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is, and then we get these fascinating glimpses into the world of private jet travel.
Oh, yeah, that's when things get really surreal.
It is. So Mark, he prefers fried chicken and McDonald's.
Even though he can afford to eat anywhere in the world.
Exactly. And Wynn-Williams talks about the awkwardness of swimming in a bikini with stars visible.
Right, like these little human moments that you wouldn't expect to see in this kind of rarefied environment.
And then you have Mark playing board games on the private jet.
And trying to connect with tourists in Java, which often doesn't go very well.
Yeah, it's like he's almost out of touch with reality in some ways.
It is, like he's living in this bubble.
And then there's the batik shirt incident in Indonesia.
Oh, right, where he refuses to wear the traditional attire for his meeting with the president-elect.
Exactly. And the whole blue sukan thing, where he insists on taking this impromptu walk through the streets despite security concerns.
Which just shows you that Facebook, and maybe Mark specifically, they're not always playing by the rules.
No, they're kind of making up their own rules as they go along.
And that's going to lead to some major problems down the line.
So as we move into the second half of the book, we see Wynn-Williams's concerns about Facebook really starting to escalate.
Yeah, she's seeing things that are making her deeply uncomfortable.
And one of the biggest turning points is the China initiative.
Right, the idea of giving the Chinese government access to user data.
Including information on people in Hong Kong.
Which is a huge red flag, ethically speaking.
Absolutely. And Wynn-Williams is just floored by this proposal.
She can't believe that they're even considering it.
And then you have Joel Kaplan, who comes in with his very different approach to policy.
Right. He sees Facebook as a global superpower, like the United States.
And he's relying heavily on the State Department.
Which is a little bit unsettling, isn't it?
It is. And he even tries to set up PAICs outside the U.S., which is illegal, by the way.
Right. And Wynn-Williams has to remind him of that.
So it's like they're so focused on achieving their goals that they're not even thinking about the legal ramifications.
Exactly. And this is a pattern that we see over and over again.
Right. And increasingly, all the big decisions are being made by Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, it's a very centralized, top-down structure.
And this is really highlighted in the episode with the Columbia Summit.
Oh, right, where Mark refuses to adjust his schedule to accommodate the Colombian president.
Who's trying to negotiate a peace deal, by the way.
Right, and it just shows you that Mark is not really interested in anything that doesn't directly benefit Facebook.
Yeah, he's got tunnel vision.
And then there's Davos, which Wynn-Williams describes as this status Olympic.
Where everyone's just trying to outdo each other.
And Cheryl is in her element, working the room, making connections.
And then there's the trip to Ireland to discuss tax strategies, where Cheryl tells Wynn-Williams to stop taking notes.
Right, because they don't want any paper trail.
So it's all very hush-hush.
Very secretive.
And then Joel starts pushing for this global political campaigning strategy.
And Wynn-Williams is increasingly uncomfortable with this whole idea.
Because she's starting to see how Facebook can be used to manipulate elections.
And she's worried about the implications of that.
And then there's the Internet.org initiative.
Right, the whole thing about bringing internet access to underserved communities.
Which sounds great on the surface.
It does, but it runs into a lot of resistance, particularly in Mexico and Brazil.
Because they're concerned about net neutrality.
Right, they don't want Facebook to be the gatekeeper of the internet.
And then there are these comical moments like the UN General Assembly.
Oh, right, where everything seems to go wrong.
The teleprompter malfunctions. Someone's dressed as Big Bird.
Just like a scene out of a movie.
It is. And then there's the debate about whether to provide free Wi-Fi in refugee camps.
And Joel asks about the income levels of refugees.
Right, which is just so tone deaf.
It is, and it shows you that even when Facebook is trying to do something good, there's always this underlying focus on profit.
And then Mark's attitude starts to shift, doesn't it?
Yeah, he becomes much more aggressive.
He starts talking about offense and defense. He even has an enemies list.
It's like he's preparing for war.
And he's doubling down on free basics, despite all the criticism.
And then there's the whole war room for India.
where they're using all these manipulative tactics to try to get free basics approved.
Like pre-filled emails and misleading notifications.
It's really unethical stuff.
It is, and it shows you how far they're willing to go to get what they want.
And then we get into the really personal part of the book, where Wynn-Williams starts talking about the toll that all of this is taking on her.
Right, the burnout, the stress, the isolation.
And a big part of this is the introduction of Sadie, Cheryl's confidant.
Who has this very close, almost, I don't know, inappropriate relationship with Cheryl.
Yeah, and Wynn-Williams feels like she's being pushed out.
That she's no longer part of the inner circle.
And then she has all this trouble with her U.S. citizenship application because she's been traveling so much for Facebook.
Which just adds to the stress.
And then one of Facebook's executives, Diego Zodan, gets arrested in Brazil.
And Mark's reaction is basically to see it as an opportunity for a Facebook post.
Right. Like, he's not even really concerned about Diego.
He's more concerned about the PR.
And then Wynn-Williams gets pregnant, and she has this really traumatic experience with the Zika virus.
And she's still expected to travel for work, even though she's sick.
It's just relentless.
And then she has a really difficult childbirth.
And she's still expected to attend this leadership offsite in Hyderabad.
Even though she's just had a baby.
And then she has this HR meeting where they basically admit that they knew she was overworked during her maternity leave.
But they didn't do anything about it.
So it's like they're completely okay with exploiting their employees.
And then there's the meeting after the U.S. election, where Joel is just gushing about the Republican agenda.
Even though he didn't even vote for Trump.
Right, because he's more interested in the policy wins than he is in any kind of, moral principles.
And then there's the Lima APEC trip, where they take all these extreme measures to protect Mark from the Zika virus.
But Wynn-Williams' concerns about her own health are basically ignored.
And then Mark continues to deny that Facebook had any influence on the 2016 election.
Even though there's tons of evidence to the contrary.
And then there's the awkward encounter with John Key at APEC.
Where he's totally cold to her.
Because Facebook's power has shifted so dramatically.
And then there's the roundtable with all the presidents and prime ministers where they're all just fawning over Mark.
And then Wynn-Williams finally confronts Mark about the name internet.org.
Which is misleading because it's not really about the whole internet.
It's about Facebook.
And Mark actually concedes that she has a point.
Which is a small victory, but it's still significant.
It shows that he's not completely impervious to reason.
And then we start to see Mark's ambitions expanding beyond Facebook.
He's talking about his legacy, he's hinting at a presidential run.
And he's buying up all this land in Hawaii.
Which is causing a lot of controversy.
And Cheryl seems to be losing interest in the whole lean-in thing.
He's more focused on her personal life.
And then we get to the final part of the book, where Wynn-Williams is really starting to unravel.
She's reaching her breaking point.
And she discovers this group called the Feminist Fight Club.
Which is a secret Facebook group for female employees to talk about harassment and discrimination.
And she realizes that she's not alone.